The Alpha King chose the Maid over every princess, leaving the entire royal pack speechless forever. King Dorian Voss had never smiled during a selection ceremony, not once in 3 years of attempts, not through 3 rounds of carefully arranged introductions, not through hundreds of hours of diplomatic dinners, where women in expensive dresses said exactly the right things in exactly the right order. He sat at the head of the long banquet table on the first evening of the new selection and watched the room with the expression his advisors had long since accepted: calm, unreadable, and faintly tired. 12 princesses had arrived that week, daughters of allied packs, noble houses, and powerful territories. Each one was beautiful. Each one had been prepared for this moment since childhood. Each one represented something his kingdom needed: land, loyalty, armies, trade. He understood all of it. He had understood it since he was 19, and his father explained the mechanics of royal mating like a lesson in military strategy. Power married power. That was how dynasties survived. He lifted his glass and said nothing. Elena Maren had been awake since 4 in the morning. That was normal. The lower staff of Voss Keep rose before the sun because the palace did not run on magic. It ran on invisible people doing invisible work before the important people opened their eyes. Elena had been one of those invisible people for 3 years, and she had made a quiet peace with it. She was 23, originally from a small village near the southern border that no longer existed. A border war had taken it when she was 20, and she had walked north for 2 weeks with nothing but a bag and the stubbornness that had always been her most reliable quality. The housekeeper of Voss Keep, a stout woman named Marta, who had a practical heart beneath a strict exterior, had looked at Elena on the doorstep and said, "You look like you know how to work." Elena had said yes. That had been the entire interview. 3 years later, she knew every corridor of the keep better than some of the guards. She knew which stone floors were uneven, which hinges squeaked, which windows let in drafts that snuffed candles. She knew these things because knowing them made her job easier, and doing her job well was the only form of security she had. She did not think about kings. She thought about whether the East Corridor needed repolishing before the noble guests arrived. It did. She did it. The selection moved through its first week the way these things always did, with elaborate formality and a great deal of tension dressed up as elegance. The 12 women competed without technically competing, which meant they were always competing. They sat beautifully at meals. They demonstrated their education, their languages, their understanding of pack law and alliance history. They were charming and accomplished, and Dorian spoke to each of them with the same measured courtesy that gave nothing away. His lead advisor, a sharp older man named Councilman Aldrich, reviewed each evening's proceedings with quiet satisfaction. Everything was proceeding correctly. One princess in particular, Lady Cassiel of the Eastern Reach, was performing brilliantly. She was striking, politically astute, and her family controlled 3 crucial trade routes. Aldrich considered her the obvious choice, and had begun mentally drafting the announcement. Dorian had not told Aldrich his thoughts. Dorian rarely did. It happened on the 4th night. Dorian had left the formal dinner early, not dramatically, just quietly, the way he sometimes did when the weight of being watched by 50 ambitious people became heavier than he could carry gracefully. He took a back corridor that the guests did not use, heading toward the older part of the keep, where he sometimes walked when he needed to think without being observed. He turned a corner near the East Gallery. A young woman was on her knees at the base of a stone pillar, a cloth in her hand, working at a scuff mark with the focused patience of someone who intended to remove it completely or die trying. She was in staff uniform, gray dress, hair pulled back, no jewelry, no pretension. She did not hear him coming. He stopped walking. Later, he would struggle to explain it, even to himself. It was not something he had words for in the language of logic and governance that he usually lived inside. His wolf, the deep, ancient part of him that operated beneath thought, simply went very still and then surged forward with a certainty that bypassed every rational process he had. He knew her, not her name, not her history, but something older than names, recognized something it had been waiting for, without knowing it was waiting. She looked up. She met his eyes without flinching, which was unusual. Most people looked away from him quickly. "Sorry, Your Majesty," she said. with the practical politeness of someone who had accidentally blocked a doorway, not someone standing before a king. "I'll be finished in a moment, and out of your way." He stood there for 3 full seconds, which was long enough that it should have been strange. "Take your time," he said. He walked away. He did not sleep well that night. The second week of the selection was when things began, quietly, to come apart at the edges, at least for Dorian. He attended every event. He said everything he was supposed to say. He sat through a formal debate between 3 of the candidates on pack governance policy and asked intelligent questions. Aldrich watched him with approval. And every evening, without planning it, Dorian found himself walking the back corridors of the older wing. He told himself he was restless. Kings were allowed to be restless. The keep was large. Walking was reasonable. On the 3rd evening, he saw her again, this time in the garden corridor, carrying a stack of pressed linens toward the guest quarters. She stopped when she saw him. She gave a small, correct bow. "Your Majesty." "What is your name?" he asked. She looked briefly surprised, not flustered, just genuinely caught off guard, the way a person is when they expected a routine moment and got something else instead. "Elena," she said. "Elena Maren." "How long have you worked here, Elena?" 3 years, Your Majesty." He nodded once, as though she had confirmed something, and stepped aside to let her pass. She passed, and did not look back, because she was a practical person and could not identify any reason to look back. He watched her go, and could not entirely explain why. Elena requested a reassignment to the laundry wing 4 days later. She was not foolish. She had watched powerful men long enough to know when something was developing that she did not want to be part of. She had no interest in becoming a story, a cautionary tale whispered among the staff about the maid who caught the wrong kind of attention. She wanted her quiet work and her small safe room and her stability. Marta, the housekeeper, filed the reassignment with the residential steward. The residential steward processed it. The residential steward then discovered, 24 hours later, that the reassignment had been quietly reversed by an order from the king's household office. Marta told Elena privately, in the linen room, with an expression that was half worry and half something Elena could not read. Elena stood very still. "Did he say why?" she asked. "Kings don't explain household decisions," Marta said. Elena thought about that for a long time. Lady Cassiel was not a cruel woman by nature. She was, however, a deeply competitive one, and she had spent 26 years being the most exceptional person in every room she entered. She had not come to Voss Keep to lose. Her attendant, who had sharp eyes and better information networks than most ambassadors, had noticed the king's corridor walks, had noted the direction, had made inquiries among the lower staff, gently, over shared meals, and had pieced together something that made no political sense, but had the texture of a genuine threat. Cassiel listened to the report without expression. Then she made a decision she would later, in the privacy of her own memory, regret. The formal garden ceremony was the selection's final and most significant event. Under the solstice moon, before the assembled court, every candidate, every noble family representative, every elder councilman, the Alpha King would present the choosing flower to the woman he had selected. It was ancient ceremony. It had weight. 2 hours before the ceremony, Elena was summoned. Not invited, summoned, by 2 members of the household guard, to the garden courtyard, where the assembled court was already gathered for preliminary events. She was brought in her work clothes. She had no idea what was happening until she was standing in the center of the courtyard and Lady Cassiel stepped forward with a jeweled bracelet in her hand and a composed, regretful expression on her face. "I'm sorry to bring this before the court," Cassiel said, in a voice calibrated to sound reluctant. "But this bracelet was discovered missing from my guest chambers this morning. I have been informed, by 2 members of the lower staff, that they saw this woman in my corridor yesterday without a work assignment in that wing." 50 people looked at Elena. Elena looked at the bracelet. She had never seen it before in her life. She said nothing, because she was calculating very quickly and understood that speaking in panic would not help her. She was one staff member with no family, no rank, no advocate, in a courtyard full of people who had every structural reason to believe Lady Cassiel over her. She stood straight and kept her face still, because that was all she had. Dorian was seated at the head of the courtyard. He had been watching the approach of this moment, with an expression no one in that courtyard could read, because it was not anger, and it was not surprise, and it was not the discomfort of a man caught in an awkward situation. It was decision. He stood up. The courtyard went quiet immediately, not because he raised his voice, but because Dorian Voss had a particular quality of stillness that, when it broke into movement, commanded every eye in a room. He walked from the head of the courtyard to where Elena was standing. The distance was not short. Every step was visible. He stopped in front of her, looked at her face for a moment, just a moment, and then turned to face the assembled court. "I know this woman," he said. His voice was even and carried completely. "She has worked in this keep, with honesty and diligence for 3 years. She did not steal. I will not have her accused without evidence before my court." Nobody spoke. "The bracelet," he continued, "can be returned to Lady Cassiel's chambers. This matter is closed." The silence that followed was the kind that changes rooms permanently. What happened in the next 3 days was the most politically turbulent stretch of Dorian's reign. He dismissed the selection, formally, without softening it with diplomatic language. He thanked every candidate. He arranged return travel with full respect and appropriate gifts. He sent letters to every noble family that had sent a daughter, accepting full diplomatic responsibility for the outcome. Aldrich came to him 3 times in one day. The 3rd time, he stopped keeping his voice calm. "You are going to lose the Eastern Reach Alliance," he said. "Do you understand what that means strategically? 3 trade routes, 2 border fortifications. The Cassiel family has influence over 4 minor houses that will follow their lead." "I understand," Dorian said. "And you're choosing this anyway?" Dorian looked at him. "I'm choosing correctly," he said, "for the first time in this process." Aldrich sat down heavily and said nothing for a long moment. Then, "She's a maid, Dorian. She's a person," Dorian said, "which is more than I can say for what this selection was turning everyone into, including me." He sent for Elena through Marta, formally and with the explicit instruction that she was invited as a guest, not summoned as staff. The distinction mattered to him. He made sure Marta understood it should be communicated exactly that way. Elena arrived at his private dining room with the careful posture of someone walking into uncertain territory with their eyes open. She sat across from him. There were no other people in the room, which was unusual for a king's dinner, and which she noticed immediately. "I didn't take the bracelet," she said, before he could speak. "I know," he said. "I want to be clear that I'm not here because I feel I owe you something," she continued, in the tone of someone who had been thinking carefully about what they needed to say. "You did the right thing. That was simply the right thing. I'm grateful, but I'm not." "I know that too," he said. He almost smiled. "I didn't invite you to establish a debt. I invited you because I wanted to talk to someone who would tell me the truth." She looked at him carefully. "Kings don't usually want that." "No," he agreed. "They don't." That evening, he asked her about her village, and she told him, plainly, without performing grief or minimizing it, what had happened and what it had cost her. He listened without interrupting, which was not something she was used to from anyone, let alone someone with his power. She asked him, because she was not skilled at performing interest she did not feel, and she was genuinely curious, what it had actually been like to grow up knowing he would be king. He told her, more honestly than he had told anyone, that it had been lonely in a specific way, the way that came from never being sure whether the people around him were responding to him or to his crown. They talked for 2 hours. When she left, she walked back to the lower staff quarters and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a long time, thinking about how the most honest conversation she had experienced in 3 years had been with the most powerful man in the kingdom. The months that followed were difficult in the ways she had expected, and surprising in the ways she had not. The noble houses were cold. The court watched her with the particular attentiveness of people waiting for her to fail. There were rumors about her origins, her intentions, her character, that circulated through the territories like weather. She did not pretend it did not affect her. She told Dorian plainly when something hurt, and he did not dismiss it, or tell her to be stronger than she felt. He also did not let it change what he had decided. A genealogical investigation, commissioned not to legitimize his choice, but because his advisors needed something to present to the council, eventually traced her maternal bloodline to an ancient, dormant wolf line. The discovery gave the elders a political framework to step back from their opposition. Dorian accepted this with the pragmatic understanding that people often need a permission structure to do what they already know is right. Elena, when told about the bloodline, was quiet for a while. Then she said, "That doesn't change who I've been for 23 years. "No," he said, "it doesn't." "Does it change anything for you?" He looked at her steadily. "Nothing has ever needed to change for me. You've been enough from the first night in that corridor." The ceremony happened on a quiet winter evening. She wore green, because he had told her to choose what she wanted, and green was the color of the hills she grew up near, and she carried her past with her without apology. When she walked through the doors of the great hall, the assembled court, elders, former rivals, noble representatives who had argued against this outcome for months, went completely silent, not in protest. In the specific and involuntary silence of people watching something real happen, in a space that had been filled, for a very long time, with performance. Dorian stood at the front of the hall and watched her walk toward him, and for the first time in years, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Later, after everything, people would tell the story in different ways depending on what they wanted it to mean. Some told it as a romance. Some told it as a political lesson. Some told it to their children as evidence that the world was not as fixed as it appeared. Elena, when asked, said only that she had been trying to finish polishing a pillar the night it started, and that life had a way of interrupting the simplest tasks with the most consequential ones. Dorian, when asked, said he had spent 8 years making correct decisions. This was the first time he had made a true one,